One question that I actually get asked quite a bit, how do I maintain or increase the longevity or the lifespan of any footwear? Whether I'm buying 4-grain boot, leather boot, or any sort of footwear. It doesn't have to be hiking and backpacking, but it can be any footwear. And especially when I mentioned earlier about footwear wanting to be comfortable, wanting to conform to your foot, you find boots that fit really, really well. Especially if it's a boot that you've loved and cherished forever, and they've redesigned the boot into something else. So the question I get is how do I make my favorite boot last as long as possible, number one. And two, when do I know that it's finally time for me to retire these boots and get a new pair? The first thing is cleaning your shoes as much as possible. Whenever you're out hiking, backpacking, running, if you get dirt, mud, sand, grime, water, anything, you want to clean your footwear as much as you can. All those different organic materials that get embedded into certain parts of your shoe eventually will break down the shoe enough where the sole start to detach, or the material actually start to break down, whether it be leather, faux leather, fabric, doesn't matter. All that organic material eventually will start to break down your shoe. A lot of times too, like not cleaning them will also make your shoes become discolored. So I actually end up with a shoe that might look really great when you first buy them. A year or two down the road, you've used them enough, because you're supposed to use these shoes, right? Not just supposed to sit in the pedestal. Eventually, when you get to a point where you haven't cleaned them, they'll start to discolor. They become super grimy and dirty, and again, that gives it some characteristics and flavor, but it also is doing a lot to deteriorate the actual shoe. So cleaning your shoe as much as possible is one of the first things you need to make sure of. How do you do that? Well, a couple of ways. Obviously, just spraying it off with water and letting it dry, perfect. Especially if it's loose material like sand, mud, dirt, that kind of stuff. Sand, unfortunately, is a bit trickier just because a lot of times it'll get embedded in the actual sole itself. I had a pair of shoes at one point where the sand actually got underneath the front sole, and I could feel the sand in there and hear it sloshing around. So sand is unfortunately one of the nemesis of any sort of footwear. But if you're using water, if you're cleaning off as much as possible, even when you're out hiking, if you're hitting to a sandy part and you're getting ready to kind of take your shoes off for the day, or you're getting ready to get back in your vehicle to go home, wash them off right then and there real quick. Get all that stuff off. Even just dipping it right into a lake or a river and cleaning them off will make your life way easier when you get home to actually physically clean them. So once you've done the water thing, you've got most of the visible stuff off. How do you do the rest of it? Especially with sand and smaller stuff getting into the actual fabric. And that's where you get into materials like cleaning gel or sandal wash, where you can actually use this, and this material actually will scrub itself into the actual shoe material itself. It'll get in there, it'll be basically like soap for your shoes. It'll get in there, it'll clean it all out, spray it off again with water, and let it dry. Doing that almost every single time you go out on a relatively big trip. Now, if you're in an area where you don't have a lot of organic material around, you just running on pavement, and it's nice out, it's not raining, and so you're not going to be in many spaces where you need a lot of that organic material on your shoes. You don't necessarily have to wash them off, but 85% of the time you're going to have something that's going to end up on your shoe somewhere, and you want to use the gel or something like it to clean it off. Once you do that, once you've cleaned off your shoe, you've sprayed it off with water, you've cleaned all the grime and the organic material off of it, how do you effectively dry your shoes? The best way is to wash it all off and then take the insole out and then lean it on its side and let it air out that way. It does two things. One, it lets the actual liquid water, and I mentioned this in the waterproof video, it lets the liquid water drain out, but it also allows the natural airflow of the shoe to release out of both the actual part where your ankle is, as well as this part below the laces. That's the most vulnerable, less material spots of the entire shoe, and that's where that air is going to want to go. So doing it like this I mean, heat rises, but air doesn't rise. You want to have it this way so it actually kind of flows out. Okay, so leaning them outside, make sure you pull this out is one really great way to actually dry out your boots. You can, although it's not advised, you can actually use boot dryers, where they be like something like this, where you're actually putting it in there and it creates a fan and dries it out that way. Or there's ones that are vertical that actually blow air in. You kind of put your boots on top of them. Those are great if you need the boots right away the next day. Or if you've got, say, like a pair of ice cream or mountaineering boots, or a boot that has like an inner boot inside of it. The only thing you're actually drying out is the inner boot and not the outside, right? So I personally tend to not use these when I'm drying out a pair of hiking shoes. Especially if I don't need them the next day, I will just pull the insole out, lay it outside, let them dry on their own. The reason being is that if you use those boot dryers, fast boot dryers on hiking boots, especially if they're waterproof, like these, believe it or not, that actually ends up deteriorating the fabric inside the shoe faster than if you were just letting them dry out on their own. So I tend not to use boot dryers unless I absolutely need the boots the next day. Now, if I'm out on the trail, I don't bring these with me when I'm out on the trail, okay? I generally just leave them on the side. And that's when we talk about waterproof versus non-waterproof. If I'm cleaning them off, I need them to dry out fast, I'm going with a non-waterproof one. I'll lay them on its side, pull the insole out, put them in the sun. They're dry within about maybe an hour or two. Second thing to think about is, okay, I've washed my shoes numerous times, but I've gotten that sand and that grime and grit into the bottom of my sole. And now my outsole is starting to become detached from the physical shoe. Does it mean that I have to now get a new pair of boots? Not necessarily. If you catch it early enough and you're able to kind of peel a little bit more of that back, clean out some of the grime and stuff that's causing the sole to become detached, you can actually use a product called Resole and actually re-adhere that sole to the actual boot. Because the reason it's becoming detached, this goes back to cleaning, is that sand and grime and everything is removing or deteriorating the adhesive that adheres that outsole to my boot. Once that comes undone, it's eventually going to keep going. So if I get to a point where I've got maybe half the insole coming off, all I got to do is really clean that thing out, really get it clean, let it dry, and then throw the Resole on and resole that back on there. It's basically re-adhering the sole to your boot. You put it on there, you clamp it together, you let it sit for almost 24 hours to 48 hours, and you're golden. Your sole is now back on it. And you can even test it too to make sure that if you were to step in water, you're not going to get water in the inside of that sole that'll come up through the bottom of the inside of the boot. One of the things we also talked about in one of the videos is waterproofing. I mentioned about the ability to waterproof a non-waterproof shoe. Now, I'm not going to go into that topic again. What I am going to go into is, okay, if I have a boot, whether it be Gore-Tex, Be-Dry, any other proprietary waterproofing material, if I'm noticing, much like I would if I was wearing a Gore-Tex jacket, where I have certain parts of the jacket that are pooling, where moisture is collecting and it's not beating off the jacket anymore, which means I'm getting moisture not only embedded in the jacket but on the inside of the jacket, which makes the jacket no longer waterproof. The same can occur with footwear, where I'm getting pooling in certain parts of the boot, and that boot itself fully is no longer waterproof. So how do I re-waterproof that? Unlike a jacket, I can't throw my boots, well I could, but I can't throw my boots in the dryer, right? I can't wash them in the washing machine, I can't dry them, they'll just get destroyed, right? So how do I re-waterproof this? Because the heat from the dryer and jackets will reinvigorate that waterproofing membrane as well as the durable water repellency coating, or DWR, that's on top of the jacket. But I can't do that with footwear. So how do I re-waterproof this? That's where, depending on the footwear you're using, there's a number of different products that can help you re-waterproof it. And it's basically taking a waterproofing liquid and embellishing it around the outside of the boot. And that kind of depends on what types of boot you have. For example, if you're using nubuck and suede, like we're talking about maybe a nicer pair of boots or a winter pair of boots, a lot of winter boots have nubuck or suede leather on the outside. What this does is this is a spray-on, right? You spray it on your boot like that, right? You can't see that. Just like this, all right? And then you'll use an emery cloth. And people are like, what is an emery cloth? think of a Scotch-Brite. That green rough pad on the edge of a Scotch-Brite, that's emery cloth. And you're going to use that to basically scuff up the nubuck, and then spray this on and scuff it up again. And that allows the waterproofing to embed itself in the leather. The same is true with regular leather and fabric. So this is particularly for nubuck and suede, right? This one is for fabric and leather. So in this Loa Camino, which has a leather outsole, right? This upper is leather, and it's got Gore-Tex in it. I have certain pooling in this. I want to prevent that. How do I do that? I can take this waterproofing and embellish that into that particular area. I don't have to do the entire shoe, right? If it's only one spot that's causing it, I can focus all my attention with this particular, this is a little bit different applicator, but I can put all my attention from this into that one spot. And this sponge on here is going to help embellish the material, the liquid into the actual leather, as well as quote unquote scuff up that leather. It's not actually going to scuff it up, but it's going to help the liquid embellish itself into that fabric, okay? Or leather if we're doing leather boots. Now what if we're talking about full grain leather? All right, this is kind of mid-grain leather. It's not a full grain leather because it has other materials in the actual shoe. So what if we're talking about a full grain leather boot, right? Pair of Red Wings, you know, there's a number of other brands that make full grain like leather work boots. How do we re-waterproof those? There's two different ways. One is you can use something similar to this that's just for leather. It's just leather waterproofing. It's not a leather and fabric, it's just leather. Or you can use a wax cream. I prefer the wax cream. And the reason being is that it's just like a tube of toothpaste. I'm going to put some on a fabric and I'm going to basically put that around the entirety outside of the boot. So in this case of full grain leather, I am going to waterproof the entire thing. I'm not just going to focus on one area because most leather boots that are full grain leather won't have a Gore-Tex membrane on them. Some do, but most won't. And so I want to, they have some other waterproofing on them. This is basically going to seal up that leather. All right, it's going to re-waterproof it. You can dip it in water, make sure it works, and off you go. All you're going to do, as I said, is basically squeeze this out, rub it in, let it dry, maybe do one more coat, rub it in, let it dry, you're good to go. One of the downsides to using that cream is that they become waterproof, which means you're constantly stepping in water. And in the wintertime, we basically are also stepping in water a lot with snow and things like that, when the snow melts or when we get snow. But the other one main issue with walking in the winter is salt from the roads. Salt will ruin leather boots to no end unless you maintain and take care of them. So conditioning your leather boots periodically throughout the year, not just in the winter, but periodically throughout the year, because even arid, dry areas will tend to, because leather is a organic material, right? It's for lack of a phrase, it's animal skin, okay? Much like everything else, just like, you know, my skin, I have to put lotion on it to keep it from drying out. The same goes true for your leather boots. So you have to use a conditioner that's going to basically, it does two things. One, it basically kind of reinvigorates the life of that leather, number one, and it prevents the cracking from forming on the outside of your boot. So, and I can use it on either full grain leather boots or ones that have kind of a combination. This still works great because what it does is it prevents this from cracking. And if I don't do that and allow it to crack, that's where you're going to allow that waterproofing that's no longer there. That water is going to seep right in through those cracks. And it's actually going to cause the cracks to spread. So, and this goes back to the first thing, which is cleaning, right? We're talking about walking around in the wintertime with salt, things like that. I got to clean my footwear and I want to condition it throughout the year just to make sure that I'm reinvigorating that leather. So that's a number of different things to kind of help maintain the overall part of the boot. Well, what happens if certain things break off, right? My laces break. We mentioned about the sole deteriorating and falling off the bottom. There's a number of different ways, obviously, you can do it yourself. I'm a DIYer. I love doing these things myself because I can learn. So the next time it happens, I just know exactly what to do. It's great, and it's way more cost effective. So using Resole to resole your shoes, just buying a new set of laces, finding a way, you know, with a lot of these hiking boots, they have these metal brackets that allow you to kind of pull the lace in. What happens if a bracket falls off? I can maybe find a way to reattach it myself, or I can just go without, or many people don't realize this, cobblers still exist. Cobbler, if you're not familiar with the term cobbler, cobbler is what they used to call basically a foot repairman, or a footwear repairman, or a repair woman. They basically would fix or build footwear way back in the day, and the cobblers still are around. There's a number of cobblers here in Minneapolis. They'll actually fix your shoe. They'll re-adhere the sole. They'll take care of your EVA foam. EVA foam on the inside of the shoe between the outer sole and the upper is the first thing to deteriorate as far as material. They'll redo that. A bracket falls off your shoe, they'll find a replacement bracket, reattach it, you're good to go. You get another 5-6 more years out of that boot. So whether you're doing it yourself or trusting your cobbler, there are a number of different ways to make that boot last significantly longer. So maintaining your footwear, especially if it's a piece of footwear you've loved for eons and years, is one of the best things you can do for a brand new purchase. Thinking about, okay, I'm buying a brand new boot, how am I going to make this last as long as possible? And having those answer those questions, okay, how do I waterproof it? How do I add laces? How do I prevent it from cracking and drying out? All those questions and all those answers are going to help you maintain that relationship with your footwear as long as possible. What that also translates to, it's going to allow you to stay on the trails out longer and keep you out there hiking as long as possible. I hope you enjoyed this video on maintaining your footwear. If you have any more questions, definitely leave some comments below in the video itself. Otherwise, stop into Minneapolis Mountaineering, find myself or one of our footwear specialists. We'll answer all those questions you have. We'll see you here in the store, and we'll see you out on the trail.